Second killer. One of the most persistent theories argues that Pamela Voorhees did not act alone in the original 1980 film. This theory claims an adult Jason Voorhees was already alive and assisting his mother during the events of the first movie. It explains the physical impossibility of Pamela, a 50-year-old woman, throwing Brenda's body through a cabin window with such force. The theory addresses how bodies were hung high in trees and nailed to doors, feats requiring significant upper body strength that Pamela simply wouldn't possess. It supports the idea that Jason witnessed his mother's decapitation firsthand, which fuels his rage in Part 2. The theory also explains why the killer's hands sometimes appear masculine, hairy, and large in first-person point-of-view shots before the reveal. References in the game Friday the 13th, the game, include Pamela's tapes that reveal her speaking to Jason, confirming the depth of her madness. While the physical feats in the movie are difficult for Pamela's character type, there's no on-screen confirmation of Jason's presence until the dream sequence, and the point-of-view hand's continuity error remains the primary visual evidence. This theory fixes the biggest logic gap in the original film, Pamela's superhuman strength, and adds a layer of tragedy, implying Jason and his mother were a killing team before her death. Hermit hypothesis. Contrary to the legend, this theory posits that Jason never actually drowned in 1957. It suggests Jason washed ashore after the counselors ignored him and simply lived in the woods as a feral child. This explains why Jason is a fully grown adult in Part 2, set 5 years after the first film, rather than a supernatural revenant. He grew up feeding off the land and stealing from the camp, explaining his survival skills and hillbilly appearance in Part 2, complete with flannel shirt and overalls. The theory explains why his shack in Part 2 is filled with stolen items and looks lived in rather than a magical tomb. It's supported by Part 2 character Paul Holt's campfire tale, where the legend suggests Jason wasn't dead but merely missing. This fits the visual depiction of Jason in Part 2 as human, running, and feeling pain, though it contradicts the death-cursed supernatural angle of later films. It grounds the early franchise in reality, making Jason a tragic victim of neglect rather than a zombie, which aligns better with the tone of the first 4 movies. Paul Holt lives. The fate of Paul Holt at the end of Part 2 remains one of the franchise's biggest unresolved mysteries. This theory states Paul survived the encounter and simply went for help while Ginny was in shock. In the final scene, Ginny asks "Where's Paul?" while being loaded into the ambulance, but we never see a body. The jump scare of Jason crashing through the window is widely accepted as Ginny's hallucination, similar to the first movie's ending. If the window crash is a dream, then the fight ended with Jason unconscious and Paul alive. Part 3 news reports mention 8 victims, which matches the body count excluding Paul. While the 8 victims count in Part 3 technically allows for Paul's survival, there are conflicting reports from filmmakers, with some saying he died and others leaving it ambiguous. It fundamentally changes the ending of Part 2 from a tragedy to a survival story, making Paul one of the few male survivors in the series. Imposter Jason. A fascinating theory suggests the killer in Part 2 is not the same person as the killer in Part 3 and Part 4. Part 2 Jason runs, feels pain, has long red hair, and wears a sack. Part 3 Jason walks, ignores pain, is bald or deformed, and wears the hockey mask. The theory argues Part 2 Jason was the hermit, the real Jason, who died from the machete wound to the shoulder. The killer in Part 3 is an entity, a copycat or a resurrected Super Jason that took over the body. Alternatively, Part 5 sets a precedent for copycats with Roy Burns, suggesting Part 2 might have been a deranged admirer or even Elias Voorhees. This explains the massive continuity error in Jason's face design between the 2 movies, from mongoloid features in Part 2 to a lumpish monster in Part 3. While the radical visual difference between Part 2 and Part 3 Jason is verified, no text supports 2 separate killers, though the visual evidence is strong. This theory attempts to rationalize the jarring shift in Jason's behavior and look, which changed the character from a running hillbilly to the slow-walking tank pop culture recognizes. Impossible timeline. The events of Part 2, Part 3, and Part 4 supposedly happen over a single long weekend, but the timeline is mathematically impossible. The Weekend of Terror theory attempts to squeeze 3 movies into 3 days, Friday through Sunday. Part 2 is Friday the 13th, Part 3 starts the next day, Saturday the 14th, and Part 4 starts that night or Sunday. However, Part 3 characters find a newspaper regarding the Part 2 murders, which wouldn't be printed and delivered that fast. The theory proposes a time loop, or floating timeline, where Crystal Lake exists outside standard time. Alternatively, it argues Part 3 takes place a week later, despite the events of Last Night dialogue, implying a memory gap or poor police work. While continuity errors regarding dates and weather are verified, the time loop or supernatural time explanation is fan speculation. This highlights the chaotic continuity of 80s slashers and tries to apply logic to a series that famously ignored it. Roy Burns' Possessed. Friday the 13th, A New Beginning, is hated for its fake Jason twist, but this theory redeems it completely. It claims Roy Burns, the paramedic killer, was actually possessed by the spirit of Jason Voorhees. This explains how a middle-aged paramedic could crush a skull with a belt, break through solid doors, and survive being hit by a tractor. Roy displays superhuman strength and durability that matches Jason's, which is impossible for a normal human. The theory explains Roy's silence as he never speaks or screams, mimicking Jason's behavior perfectly. The possession mechanic is later canonized in Jason Goes to Hell, proving Jason's spirit can jump bodies. It suggests the vision Tommy Jarvis sees is actually Jason's spirit jumping from Roy to him at the end. While Roy's feats of strength are verified in the film and body jumping is verified in Jason Goes to Hell, connecting the two films is fan interpretation. It validates Part 5 as a real Friday the 13th movie, arguing that Jason was the killer, just using Roy as a meat suit. Cannibal Crystal Lake. How did Jason survive in the woods for over 20 years without a job or grocery store? This theory claims Jason is a cannibal who eats campers and animals. It explains the sexual mutilation mentioned in the Part 3 news report, arguing it wasn't sexual but Jason harvesting meat. Jason Goes to Hell features a scene where Jason, in a host body, shaves a man and appears ready to eat him. The theory explains why he drags bodies back to his shack instead of leaving them where they fall, like Terry in Part 2. While the sexual mutilation line is in Part 3, cannibalism is never explicitly shown, only implied by his survival. This adds a gruesome layer of realism to his survival and explains the missing bodies in the franchise. Deadite connection. This is perhaps the most famous unconfirmed theory, that Jason Voorhees is actually a Deadite from the Evil Dead universe. The theory claims Pamela Voorhees used the Necronomicon Ex Mortis to resurrect Jason after he drowned. The evidence includes the Necronomicon and the Kandarian dagger appearing in the Voorhees house in Jason Goes to Hell. Director Adam Marcus has stated in interviews that this was his explicit intent, but he couldn't say it in the movie due to rights issues. This explains Jason's specific type of immortality as a demonically possessed corpse, not a zombie. It explains why he can be killed temporarily but always comes back, requiring dismemberment or enchantment to stop, like a Deadite. It connects the two biggest horror franchises of the 80s into a shared universe. While the props appear in Jason Goes to Hell and the director confirmed intent in interviews, it's never stated in dialogue or plot text of the movie. While the director confirmed it outside the movie, the film itself leaves it as an Easter egg. This theory provides the only magic system explanation for Jason's powers. By the way, if you're enjoying this type of content, I make videos like this all the time. Subscribing would really help me out. Elias Voorhees Wizard. The mystery of Jason's father, Elias Voorhees, has spawned a theory that he is the true architect of the curse. Elias is never seen in the movies, but he pays the property taxes on the camp and house, as implied in novels and comics. The theory argues Elias knew about the Necronomicon, hence it being in the house, and perhaps taught Pamela or used it himself. This explains why the house remains standing and the bills are paid despite Pamela being dead for years. Some fans theorize Elias is a warlock or cultist who consecrated the land of Crystal Lake. Scripts and storyboards for Jason Goes to Hell included a character Elias who was cut, hinting at his intended involvement. While Elias is canon in extended media and comics, his magical involvement is speculation to explain the book's presence. This expands the lore beyond just Pamela and Jason, suggesting a generational evil or a Rosemary's Baby type situation. Crazy Ralph's secret. Crazy Ralph wasn't just a local drunk. He knew exactly what was happening, because he was involved. This theory claims Ralph was a former counselor or caretaker who knew about Jason's survival. It explains why he is always watching the camp and knows exactly when people arrive, warning them that they're all doomed. Some variations suggest Ralph is Jason's biological father through an affair with Pamela, explaining his guilt and obsession with the death curse. The theory explains why Pamela, who killed everyone else, let Ralph live for so long until Part 2. While this is pure speculation based on character behavior, Ralph does survive Pamela's original spree despite being a local. This turns a comic relief character into a tragic figure, burdened with a dark secret he can't articulate. Cursed land. What if Jason isn't the source of the evil, but merely a symptom of the land itself? This theory argues Camp Crystal Lake sits on cursed ground, possibly a Native American burial ground, a trope referenced in the comics. The curse infects people, driving Pamela mad, Roy Burns mad, and bringing Jason back to life. It explains why reasonable people, like the mayor in later films, refuse to close the camp because they are under the land's influence. The theory supports the idea that Jason is an elemental protector of this specific geography. It explains why Jason never leaves the camp until Part 8, where he is forced. While the death curse is mentioned frequently by locals, the nature of the curse being the land itself is fan interpretation. This shifts the genre from slasher to folk horror, making the location the true antagonist. Teleportation Ghost. In Friday the 13th, Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan, Jason inexplicably teleports around the ship and city. Critics call it bad editing, but this theory argues Jason has become a water wraith or ghost entity. He dissolves into water, puddles, sewage, the lake, and reforms elsewhere. This explains the famous disco scene where he appears on the dance floor instantly. It explains how he gets from the ship to the city without a boat. The ending of Part 8 supports this, where he melts away into toxic waste, suggesting his body is fluid or spectral. While teleportation happens on screen, with logically impossible movement, the water wraith explanation tries to justify the bad editing. This attempts to fix the most ridiculed aspect of the 8th movie by leaning into the supernatural evolution of the character. Tina created zombie. Did Tina Shepard resurrect Jason, or did she create a new monster entirely? In Part 7, Jason has been rotting at the bottom of the lake for years. Tina's psychic pulse hits the lake, and this theory argues this energy didn't just wake him, but reanimated him into a super zombie. It explains why Jason looks more decomposed and skeletonized in Part 7 than ever before, because he was just bones until her magic filled him out. The theory connects his sudden regenerative look to her telekinetic power source. While Tina's powers are the catalyst in the film, the distinction between waking up and creating is theoretical. This makes Tina responsible for the later era unkillable Jason, adding to her tragedy. Dream endings real. The first 3 movies all end with a dream sequence jump scare, but this theory argues they aren't dreams at all. In Part 1, Jason did grab Alice. She fainted, and he let her go, or the police arrived just in time, forcing him to retreat. In Part 2, Jason did crash through the window. He fought Paul, killing him, while Ginny passed out. In Part 3, the lady in the lake was real, maybe a hallucination of Pamela or a corpse floating up, but the attack happened. The theory argues that dismissing these scenes as just dreams is a cop-out. Treating them as reality makes Jason a more active hunter who toys with victims. It explains Alice's post-traumatic stress in Part 2 because she knows the boy in the lake was real. While all endings are framed as waking up in hospital tropes, treating the jump scares as canon events is theoretical. This reinterprets the franchise's signature trope as actual plot events rather than cheap scares. Moral Guardian. A sociological theory claims Jason isn't evil, but a supernatural enforcer of 1950s conservative morality. Jason died in 1957 because counselors were having relations instead of watching him. He targets teens engaging in premarital relations, drug use, and alcohol, behaviors that led to his death. He often ignores children, like the kids in Part 6 Cabins, and sometimes spares innocent characters until they transgress. The theory suggests his rage is a specific punishment for the sins that killed him. It explains why the virgin final girl is the one who usually defeats him. While the pattern of victims matches the theory, and Jason spares the kids in Part 6 explicitly, assigning moral intent to a slasher villain is theoretical. This is the definitive meta-theory of the slasher genre, codified by Scream, but here applied literally to Jason's motivation. Water fear regression. Freddy vs. Jason introduced a controversial weakness, that Jason is afraid of water, which contradicts earlier films. Fans hate this because Jason goes in water constantly in Parts 4, 6, 7, and 8. This theory fixes it by arguing Jason isn't afraid of water as an adult. Freddy didn't use water to scare adult Jason. He used it to regress Jason mentally back to being a child. In the dream world, Jason becomes the drowning boy again. That boy is afraid of water. It explains why he freezes in the dream, but is fine fighting on the dock in the real world. Jason is shown as a child in the dream sequence, and Jason enters water willingly in previous films. So this theory reconciles the plot hole. This redeems the writing of Freddy vs. Jason by adding psychological depth to the battle. Jason's symbiote. The strangest theory from Jason Goes to Hell implies Jason is actually a parasitic worm. The movie shows a hell baby creature passing from body to body. This theory argues the human Jason Voorhees died long ago. The entity is a demonic parasite, the worm, that pilots bodies. The hockey mask body was just its favorite, or longest-lasting host. It explains why he looks different in every movie, because the parasite is constantly repairing or modifying the host meat. When the host is destroyed, blown up in Jason Goes to Hell, the worm seeks a new one immediately. While the Hellbaby worm is the main plot device of Jason Goes to Hell, extending this backwards to explain parts 2 through 8 is theoretical. This is the most alien explanation for the character, completely dehumanizing him into a biological weapon of hell. If you found this worth your time, consider subscribing so you never miss new content. Thanks for watching.